Welcome to The Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Wilner. Today, I am so excited to speak with Dr. Jeffrey Wilson. His bio is just amazing, and frankly, I'm really jealous. Dr. Wilson has worked as an actor, firefighter, paramedic, jet pilot, diving instructor, and Navy combat surgeon. He has served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Jeffrey is perhaps best known for creating the character of John Dempsey for the Tier 1 thrillers. Along with his co-writer, Brian Andrews, he is also the author of Sons of Valor and many other books. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor, locumstory.com. Maybe you're curious about locums and how it might fit into your career story. But do you know all the different reasons physicians choose locums and how it works for them? At locumstory.com, you can hear firsthand stories as diverse as physicians themselves. There's not one solution for everyone. The variety of opportunities might surprise you. Locum Story is an unbiased educational resource. It has tools that let you explore trends in your specialty and compare different locums agencies. There's even a simple quiz to see if locums is right for you. Do your own research at locumstory.com. It's easy. And now to my guest. Welcome, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking to you. That's cool. I love that you're sponsored by a locums company because for someone like me who transitioned from medicine to something else, locums was a big deal for me. So
Wow. Okay. Now, I didn't know that. And let's just talk about that for a second, because I always sort of pitch locums as a tool for physicians, and transitioning is a big, big role for locums. And frankly, I've considered it myself on some rocky days at work. So
right.
tell me your story.
Well, in terms of how it relates to that, as you know, I'm a writer and novelist now and filmmaker. And when I made the decision that I wanted that to be a career, it's one thing to be 23 years old and fresh out of college and living in your mom's basement and trying to make it as a writer. It's another thing if you got four kids at home and you're used to a certain lifestyle as a surgeon. And locums was really important for me because you know to write a book a year, okay, you can do that in your spare time, I guess it would be the word for it. You can modify your career. That's something I've heard you guys talk about before, how to find that career balance that's right for you. As a vascular surgeon, you don't have to work 100 hours a week. You can find something else. And you can get a book a year done by doing those things. But if you want to transition to doing it full time and really focus attention, you got to have flexibility. And so for me, working locums for probably close to 2 years was an important step towards transitioning from writing as a part-time or hobby to being a full-time career. If I had not had that opportunity, it would have been really difficult, I think.
I'm going to jump ahead and ask you the question that my father always asked me when I was, a teenager and trying to be a writer. And he'd say, "Can you make a living as a writer?"
You can. It's a lot like any other business. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of dedication. It really is a small business that you're investing in. And so there is a startup phase where you're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices and tighten your belt and try to get there. I will tell you that for every writer that is making a great living at it, there's thousands that aren't, and it's not because they're not good writers. It's usually because luck just didn't fall their way. They sent it and it sat on the editor's desk the day he had a fight with his wife, or who knows why, or because they weren't really focused on the business aspects of it. It's really like any other business. And if you don't educate yourself and have some business savvy of how to grow into that career, it's just hard to be successful. The days of writing one book and getting $1 million deal, the next one, those are over. They've been over for decades. And so you really do have to grow it as a business. And Brian and I, as you know, I write with Brian Andrews. Brian and I were able to come together on what that should look like, and then have great families who supported us. So, yeah, you can make a living. I'm making more now than most of my vascular surgeon friends, I would argue. But it was a lot of work to get here. So,
Yes. Okay, so that's good to know. So you did not have to sacrifice your income in the long run.
Right.
But I suspect, I mean, vascular surgeons, work pretty hard usually. And so you were no stranger to kind of putting your nose to the grindstone, as it were. But that unless there's some sort of incredible stroke of luck, it turns out to be there's a lot of toil involved.
Yeah, I think that's true in anything. And, my dad used to tell me anything worth doing is worth toiling over a bit, right? So yeah, there was work. I'm very lucky that, well, first of all, I didn't really spend much time in the civilian world as a vascular surgeon. So I wasn't, working against a great big salary that I needed to make up at first. Most of my time in the medical world was in the Navy, and as you may be aware, we don't make quite as much as our civilian counterparts. And when I transitioned out of the Navy, most of what I was doing, my writing was already taking off. So most of what I was doing was either part-time work, well, what we would consider part-time. My wife would look at it and say, "Well, you're working like 40 hours a week. How is that part-time?" It's like, well, I'm a vascular surgeon. That's part-time. Um, or doing the locum stuff. And so I was able to bridge the gap. So I had some income streams coming from writing, and then I was able to make up the difference between doing that full time and the writing through locums and part time work. So
Oh, well, thanks for that, because that's the kind of frank discussion that's really hard to get from successful people. And I think it's very, very valuable. All right. So we're going to take a step back. I mean, you were in the Navy, you were a surgeon, you were assigned to combat teams, right?
yeah,
You were in inhospitable foreign countries. I think that's fair to say.
very fair.
And at some point, you said, "Well, I think I want to sit in my den and drink scotch and write thrillers." So to me, that's kind of a leap.
Yeah.
At least it sounds like a leap. So explain why it wasn't such a leap.
Well, I'll say this. First of all, my journey to that was a little bit circuitous. So you've read my bio, Andrew. So my mom says I have an attention deficit problem, or that I can't keep a job. I'm not sure what she's saying these days, but I have done a lot of things in my life. I've been a pilot and all these other things, and I didn't even go to medical school till I was 30. So I had a pretty eclectic background already. In terms of this transition to writer for my writing partner, Brian Andrews, it was a little different. He was a submarine officer, and he had never written anything other than school stuff his whole life until after he made the decision late in life to become a writer. For me, it was the opposite. So I have a very eclectic backstory. I've done a lot of different things, but the one thread that pulls through all of the things I've done has been writing. I actually published my first short story when I was, I think, 13 or 14. And so, whatever career I found myself in, writing was always a huge part of my life, like I think it is for you. Sometimes as a hobby, sometimes as an outlet, sometimes just because it's what I did. And so, for me, it was more saying, hey, here's this thing I've done my whole life. And now I've published a book, I've got another one coming. I wonder if it's something that I could actually make a living at. So it wasn't like out of the blue. I was like, I wonder if I could be a writer. I was already a writer from the creative standpoint. Making the business decision and the family decision to embrace it as a career was obviously a different story. And it required, I have the most amazing wife and children as well. My wife, Wendy, has always been one who is like, whatever you want to do, find God's purpose, fulfill your dreams. God puts things on your heart for a reason, all of those sorts of things. And so she was very supportive. But remember, she also had a little bit of history of having to be that. So when I was in the Navy, my initial deployment was with the Marines, but eventually I was with a JSOC SEAL team. So she was already used to sacrifice and tolerating quite a bit. So I imagine in her mind, hey, why don't you be a writer was a lot easier than, hey, why don't you go deploy with the JSOC SEALs? So maybe that was she was worried I was going to go back to that. I don't know. I don't know what she was, but you do have to have that support system for sure.
Well, it sounds like although you had many interests, they all required a fair amount of dedication. I mean, you can't become a jet pilot, on a weekend. It requires some study and practice to to make it back to the ground. I think the taking off part is easier than the landing, and you got to be
Right.
pretty consistent. So no stranger to self discipline. Which that's I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I mean, I noticed. I think you have. It's got to be about 10 books now.
27, I think, is where we are at last count.
27
Yeah.
books. So at one a year, that's 27 years. Uh,
Yeah, so we're in a weird here's our business model, Andrew. When Brian and I decided we're going to do this, we're going to go for it. And I've always been I either do things or I don't. It's 110% or it's 0%. I don't muddle in the middle. Like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so when Brian and I decided let's do it, we had this business model where we said we've got all these different story ideas. We have this idea for an entire series called the Tier 1 series, which, as you know, has been pretty successful. But we had all these other ideas. And so we said, let's do this. We're going to just blast everything out there and see what sticks. And if we've got 3 or 4 different series arcs out there and 1 or 2 of them stick, we could probably make a living at it. And we were very blessed in that they all stuck. So the blessing and curse of that is that we actually write 4 books a year right now because that's what our contracts require. So once I'm not sure if you're aware, but we write the Tom Clancy books now for the Jack Ryan series.
oh, I didn't
So,
know that. That's
yeah.
fantastic.
So once we added that, that took us to 4 books a year. So we actually have to write a book about every 3 months, which is insane. And it's also not sustainable. Obviously, we're going to, I think, another year or 2 of that, and then we're going to have to slow down on that side of it. And then we took the same approach to the media side. So we wanted to see if we could move stuff into the media. And so we said, let's just pitch different things. And Tier 1 has sold. It's been optioned for television, but we also sold like 11 other things. So we have about a dozen projects right now for TV and film with us as executive producers, us as writers for some of them. But it was the same thing. It's like, sort of be careful what you wish for, because now like we have to actually do these things. Um, so yeah, not a book a year. We were writing 2 books a year from the time we started as Andrews and Wilson. The first year we did just the 1 book, and when it was successful, we added the others. But now we're writing with the Clancy. We're now writing 4 books a year somehow. I'm not sure how, but we've made all our deadlines so far. So we'll see.
Okay, a couple questions. One, um, as someone who writes, I think one of the reasons I do write is because it's very personal and it's internal, and I make all of the decisions. I'm kind of big on that. And I can't imagine having a co-writer. How does that work?
I'll be honest with you. I also couldn't imagine having a co-writer. So when I met Brian, we were both already writers. So I think I had 2 books out and a third one coming, and he had a book out and another one coming. And we met at a writers conference. I'll give a plug for them. It's International Thriller Writers has a conference every year called Thriller Fest, and it is truly writers helping writers. I mean, it is, the first time I went there, I'm a debut author. I was nobody. No one had ever heard of me. And I'm having cocktails with like Lee Child. And he's like, how can I help you? And John Land and all these people that I knew their names. And they were like there and meeting my wife and saying, here's my email. How can I help? And now we do the same thing. We try to pay it forward for the writers coming behind us. So I met Brian there. And he was a Navy veteran. I was a Navy veteran. I'm a little socially impaired. Like I can socialize, I just don't like it. And at the time, I was still, you know, I was still struggling with some PTS issues from my combat service. And so I was in my hotel room with my wife and I'm looking through the brochure and I'm trying to find other dudes who are military. And I'm
Hmm.
like, okay, if I can see that guy, I'm memorizing their picture. If I see that guy, I can talk to that guy, right? And so I see Brian at the cocktail party. He's sitting by himself at a table because he's a submariner. So who's going to talk to him? And I go over and talk to him, and we become fast friends. We're both very family focused people. Our kids are the same age. And about a year later, we were in New York again for the conference. And he said, we were both in between projects trying to figure out what our next book was going to be. He said, I think what we should do is we should partner up. Like we should do this thing where we co-author like Preston and Child do, or some of these others. Kathy Coulter does it with JT Ellison, or she did. And he said, the SEAL community. I know submarines. We do SEALs and subs. And And I immediately told him, absolutely not. Like you, I'd been writing my whole life. Like I just couldn't even imagine what would that look like. Like I write the nouns, you write the verbs. Like, what do you even mean when you say that? I said, but I'll help you. Like if you need some help with the special warfare aspect. So we start brainstorming this out. And so you're a neuro guy, so you'll appreciate this. Brian basically used his psychology degree to manipulate me. So we built this great story, and he asked me a second time if we could write it together. I said I just didn't think it would work. And so we have this whole story mapped out, and it's the first tier one book. And it's a great story. I'm like, this is a really great story. I'm getting a little jealous that I've helped this guy develop this great story. So he says, all right, here's what we're going to do. Let's just try it. Let's write 5 chapters. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, no harm, no foul. You can have the book and it'll be yours. And I was like, I just got a great book, right? So we sat down, we started writing, and we write. I don't know how much of the craft side of it you want to get into, but we write in a very strange way that none of the other co-authors do. We actually write simultaneously. So our books, as you've seen, are multi POV. So we divide each. We do a 3-act structure. So we took Act 1 and we divided it. I'll write Dempsey and you write Jarvis, and then in the other one we'll switch or whatever. So we just start writing simultaneously, and we talk on the phone 4 or 5 times a day. So we start writing these 5 chapters, and I don't think we ever circled back and even talked about it. We just wrote the whole book. It took us like 4.5 months, wrote the entire novel, and we never looked back. We've never done anything else since. So yeah, Brian manipulated me, and thank goodness he did, because it obviously worked out. But yeah, it is a little weird. And it does require a lot of discipline, but it also requires a lot of trust. As a surgeon, I can tell you I understand what it is to be part of a team. I always ran my OR as a team thing. I always wanted people to feel empowered to point out anything they didn't like. If you're in the middle of an aorta and it's clamped and a resident sees something, I don't want him to be afraid to say, I don't think that stitch is going to hold, right? So, and as military guys, we know that no, there's no Mitch Rapp. There's no SEAL kicking in a door by himself and saving the universe. Not one guy runs an $8 billion submarine. So this team and mission before self ethos was sort of bred into us already. And I think that's why it works, because there's no ego involved. You talked about, oh, it's all mine. We don't feel that. We feel like it's ours. Like, I've got 4 kids, and I can tell you that in my house, it's not like, okay, the boys are mine and the girls are Wendy's, and if you have questions, let me know. Like, we look at each of them as God's gift to us that we're responsible for, and we co-parent each child, and we do it differently. And that's how we approach books. Together as a team, we want to create the best book that we possibly can. And so as we're writing these chapters, every 3 or 4 chapters, we swap them. And I'll rewrite his and he rewrites mine. And there's no conversation. I don't say, hey, I'm going to change this. I just do it. And he does it. And so in the end, both of our voices have been there. His strengths have weighed out my weaknesses and vice versa. And into the master file goes this perfect one voice story that works. So it is weird, but it is something I think was informed by my medical background and by our military background. So, and you're part of a team in your specialty too. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. You got to trust your technician. You got to trust your nurse, your physician extender. And if you don't, you drive yourself crazy, right? You couldn't possibly be efficient. So it's sort of similar to that.
Unbelievable. Uh, so much to unpack there. First, I'll throw out some trivia, and that you may know, but I'm sure Brian will appreciate it, that Robin Cook wrote his first medical thriller when he was stationed for a year in a submarine.
It's a good place to do it. I did not
So
know that. He was a dive medical officer in the Navy?
I'm not sure what his role was, but he was in the Navy in a submarine, and I guess he had some downtime. And that's where his writing career, as really, he's one of the fathers of the medical thriller
For
genre,
sure.
I would say. I read him as a teenager. You wanted to be Robin Cook,
Yeah.
right? So he wrote his. I always remember that while he was in a submarine. Not too many distractions, I guess. Um, Yeah, that's just fantastic. I think it is unique, and I'm sure your military backgrounds did play a role in your connection,
Yeah, for sure.
and that really shows through in the writing. It and I've read it at least two of your books, and I read very very closely, with a pen. Right, I'm a I'm an editor, and I didn't find anything to fix, and I also didn't hear two voices. So that's interesting. But I was fascinated by the characters. They were not shallow characters. John Dempsey, who becomes fleshed out more and more and more, and then reborn. Really spectacular creation. And I was even more interested in Jarvis and his kind of special powers because he's a little neurodivergent. I thought that was a very interesting characterization of someone who is in a kind of a military spy novel.
Yeah,
How did that happen?
this sounds like something you just make up, but it's true that Andrews and Wilson Brandis, we're so interwoven now that I can't tell you which of us came up with that idea. But it is interesting, and working in a profession like you do, you too have encountered people when you encounter people that function at a very high level, whether it's in medicine or it's in government service or special operations. It is not that unusual to find that they're unusual. Now, we found a kind of a
Okay.
fun medical way to express what his uniqueness was. But there are a lot of people that you run into, and I can tell you that in the SEAL community, I've run into many people some of whom are still friends, who share a lot of those characteristics with Kelso Jarvis. They just see the world differently. The synesthesia and all that stuff, that was just fun. My wife has that, and so it was fun to blend that in. But some of the other ways that his thought process works and the chameleon aspects of his
Hmm.
personality, you could even argue that there are elements of his personality that might even put him on the spectrum. And I think it was fun to do that because Brian and I both have worked with people, usually very high level people in the military, who have those quirky characteristics, but they have become highly functional by relying on them and embracing them instead of shunning them for social construct, right? So it was a really cool idea. I want to go on a limb and say Brian came up with the idea for Kelso to have those aspects, but it was really fun. It was really fun to write. I will say that it is a little. You're right. It's unusual in a thriller to have those elements, but I think that's why we've been successful. The thriller genre tends to be very plot driven, and as well it should be. Like, some terrorist has a nuke and they're going to do this or that, and you need your character to fix it. Of course, the plot drives much of it. But my favorite people growing up were the folks that wrote very character driven stuff, and I think maybe the best example in the thriller genre is probably Another Physician, Michael Crichton. He was really good at fleshing out character. And I read Stephen King growing up, and he could write a book about someone reading the Yellow Pages, and it'd be fascinating because the character is so real. And so it is a little unusual that we put a lot of character and a lot of relationship arc that spans multiple books into a thriller. And it was a bit of a risk because we didn't know how that would be received. I don't think the average reader knows that's why they like it, or why they like it better than a different book. But I believe with all my heart it is. That's why, because these characters become real for them, instead of just a cartoon character of a seal kicking in a door. They have sacrifice, they have loss, they have relationships. Those relationships have struggles. Even within the team, I'm not talking about just romantic relationships, but within a team dynamic. There are guys in a team, maybe on a surgical team, that you rely on heavily and you're highly functional when you're together, but you don't go out and have drinks with them because you don't actually really like them that much. But when you're together as a team, you put all that aside and it's highly functional. So it was fun to pull those elements through from both of our backgrounds. And I do think that's why readers have embraced it.
Well, military thrillers is not a genre that I'm familiar with. And when we connected, before I interview a guest, I always like to, read their book, or in your case, books. And I was just amazed. It's like, gee, I couldn't wait to get home so I could read it again, and see what happened to this guy, which is usually, by the time I get home, my reading time is usually pretty limited, but I found I was pretty enthusiastic about, and I think I listened to one of the books also on an audiobook for my commute, and it was a fun story to kind of look forward to every morning. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Now we're running out of time. This has been terrific. What else do the listeners have to know?
Well, I think that one thing that I was hoping that we could chat about for just a moment is this idea of transitioning in medicine, because I have friends that are in medicine now that when I talk to them on the phone, they're like, "Oh, I'm so jealous you did this other thing." And there's this idea in medicine that you did your residency in vascular surgery, that's it. You can be a vascular surgeon because you invested so much time and you invested so much money. And I'm not against medicine by any stretch. I loved it when I was doing it. But the idea that you're locked into something for another 50 years because you did it at the front end of your life, I think is insane. And so I think that I'm not trying to talk people into leaving medicine, but I would say that if you find yourself in a point in your career where it's not giving you happiness, where you don't get up in the morning and say, "Oh, I can't wait to go and do this," then you should be open to the idea that there could be something else out there for you. You shouldn't regret what you've done, but be open to it. And maybe that looks like just changing what you do in medicine. And I think that's often the case, right? Like, okay, I've conquered all the hills. I don't want to do pancreatic duodenectomies anymore because I got to take care of the patient for a month and they don't do well. I've conquered that mountain. I was very good at it, but it's not the lifestyle I want now. Well, maybe you do something else. Maybe you transition to outpatient surgery. Maybe you transition to another subspecialty. Maybe you take your medical skills into the corporate world, or maybe, like me, you find something else you have a passion for and you do something completely different. That was very hard for my wife to get. Like,
Mm.
so you train so long. Like, how could you? In my case, it was different because I was in the Navy, and after all of my time deployed with my teammates, and I lost a lot of close friends. I lost a lot of close friends. My time in the teams, but so for me, that was another driving force was medicine. It just sort of lost its glamour because I spent time doing those things. But for whatever your personal reason is, I would challenge people: be open, be creative, find a way to be excited about getting up in the morning. If you're 45 years old and you're going to practice medicine for 20 more years, the idea of getting up every morning, loathing your day, like you can't live for the weekend, like in a job like that, and you're not going to be that good at it. So that was one thing I just wanted to share with people. Not that everyone should become a writer or even leave medicine, but for goodness sake, you're an extremely intelligent, educated person if you're in this profession. You are a creative person. You can find a way to merge your personality type with the skill set and knowledge you have into something that gives you happiness and satisfaction. And guess what? You'll be better at what you do when you can find those things.
Jeff, I sense another series of locum tenens physician, or a guy who's, transitioning and his various adventures. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Come on. And by the way, anybody that is interested in the writing side, and I shared this with Andrew earlier, we are very active in giving back to younger writers. I don't mean, age wise, but newer writers that are trying to come into the profession. Our website, andrews-wilson.com, has a way that you can get in touch with us. We love giving advice to writers. We love meeting writers at conferences and introducing them around and helping them network. So use us as a resource. If you're ready to be the next Robin Cook and the writing part is easy, but the business side is daunting, reach out to us and we're always happy to lend advice.
That is extremely generous. And thanks for that. And also, of course, your books are on Amazon and easy to find and fun to read.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, I want to thank you for joining me on the Art of Medicine.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Before we close, I'd like to give another thanks to our sponsor, locumstory.com, a resource where providers can get real, unbiased answers about locum tenens. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner. See you next time. This program is hosted, edited, and produced by Andrew Wilner, MD, FACP, FAAN. Guests receive no financial compensation for their appearance on The Art of Medicine. Andrew Wilner, MD, is Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Memphis, Tennessee. Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this program belong solely to Dr. Wilner and his guests and not necessarily to their employers, organizations, or other group or individual. While this program intends to be informative, it is meant for entertainment purposes only. The Art of Medicine does not offer professional financial, legal, or medical advice. Dr. Wilner and his guests assume no responsibility or liability for any damages, financial or otherwise, that arise in connection with consuming this program's content. Thanks for watching. For more episodes of The Art of Medicine, please subscribe. www.andrewwilner.com